Hello, my name is Christine McDaniel, and I am with the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. And I'm sitting here with Shanker Singham, who recently authored Trade, Competition, and Domestic Regulatory Policy with our dear colleague Alden Abbott. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Christine. It's good to be here.
Nice to have you back. Always is nice to have you guys back. One thing I love about your book is that it brings together these three areas of domestic competition, international competition, and regulatory policy. And usually we have those issues presented in silos, and obviously in practice, it's all very much intersected. And so when I looked at when I started reading your book, I just thought this is a book that I have to have on my bookshelf. And really any practitioner, it's just such a helpful deep dive. Then you start reading it and you realize that it really kind of takes you back to some of. It made me think about some of the basics, right? What is fairness, and it's different today, I think, than it used to be, at least in the international trade circles. I remember during, throughout the 2000s, being a trade economist in the U.S. government, economists would always be correcting the communications teams, when they wanted to say free and fair trade. We said, well, there's this whole thing about fair trade. It's really just free trade, and let us tell you what fair trade really means. But these days, it's really kind of it's hard to say free trade, isn't it?
Only fair now. So I think that's a very interesting distinction, and I think the words fair trade get bandied about a lot, and I think you have to go back to basics, as you said, and sort of ask yourself, what is the purpose of open trade? What's the purpose of trade liberalization? Before you can get into sort of what does fair trade actually mean, and the purpose of liberalization is to open up trade for competition. It's to open up competition. It's to use the forces of competition across borders to create wealth. So wealth it can be created or destroyed. It's not zero sum. It's very easy to destroy it, and it's very hard to create it. And to create it, we have learned that the force of competition is the only thing that is the most powerful tool that we have to do that. And human beings, we know that competition makes us better. Any athlete knows that if you subject yourself to competition, you get better. But equally, and this is, I guess, the conundrum of humanity, is that we don't want to compete. People would rather sit on their couches and watch Netflix than engage in ferocious competition. And businesses are the same way. I mean, I think there's a U.S. Supreme Court judge who talked about the best monopoly profit is a quiet life. You don't want, companies don't want to have to subject themselves to the forces of competition, but managers of companies know that this is what makes them better. So competition is the name of the game. How do you open up trade and liberalize trade so that you allow willing buyers and willing sellers to come together to meet human need in voluntary exchange? And things that get in the way of that damage competition, damage that process. So when you talk about fair trade, what I think you should be talking about is trade that allows that competition to take place. And fair trade is where you might have disciplines on countries or trading partners who don't do that, who distort their markets for competitive advantage. So it might be a subsidy, so we already have rules in the trading system to deal with subsidies. We don't really have rules in the trading system to deal with what Alden and I have christened anti-competitive market distortions, or ACMDs. And you need I would argue you need some disciplines on those ACMDs, on those distortions in other markets. So where a country is distorting its market for trade advantage, so that some of its companies get a trade advantage, that is not fair. That violates the sort of principle of trade openness being about import competition. And so you should discipline that. But should you discipline a country that does something in a different way, whether it has a labour rule that's different or an environmental rule that's different? I mean, I would argue that you shouldn't do that because different countries are at very different levels of development. And, you might be attacking by saying you must have the same, labour rule or the same environmental rule as us in the West. you might be attacking that country's very comparative advantage, the very reason they can go up the value chain and lift their people out of poverty. So, you know, you need to think about, so they're not all the same. So when you talk about fairness, these different things, these different rules, these different they're not all the same. And I think the best yardstick is to say, well, if it affects competition, then it's sort of, you know, fair game, you know, for fair trade, you know, it should be included.
But should we be, well, I'm just going to push back on, just play devil's advocate, because, you know, there's some, well, remember Paul Krugman said, you know, the best response to a country that wants to subsidize something and send it to you is a thank you note. Right? So,
Yeah.
I mean, so if China does want to subsidize blue widgets and send us blue widgets for, you know, much cheaper than we could ever make them, I mean, why not just say thank you very much, we'll take them?
And generally, you know, so the problem is not the fact that the product is coming in cheaply. Actually, competition will mean that products come in more cheaply and, you know, lower cost and more choice, and that's a good thing. And so Krugman's talking about that as a, you know, that is a good thing. But there's a difference between somebody who's efficiently achieving lower prices and somebody who is distorting markets and subsidizing and doing things that will cause competitors and producers in other countries to go out of business. Not because they're competing against somebody who's better than they are, but because in effect they're competing against another country's treasury, basically. And it depends on the country. So the effect on competition will differ depending on the country. If a very small developing country does this, it's probably not going to have very much effect on competition, and therefore probably wouldn't, under our vision, probably wouldn't be disciplined in any way. But if China does it, and if China does it across the board, it's actually it's bad in a number of ways. One, it will damage total global welfare, which is an indication of you know, the ability to create wealth in the global economy. Number one. Yes, it might help let's say a US consumer of a particular blue widget that is now much cheaper in the short term. But if all the US companies or other companies from around the world go out of business because of this distortion, and we've seen this in particular areas, we've seen this in telecom equipment with Huawei and Alcatel-Lucent and Ericsson and so on, who basically went out of business because they couldn't compete against this artificially low priced company that was also engaged in intellectual property, you know, violations and so on. So I think you need to have a system, but it can't be you've got to be very careful with your response to it. You've got to have a very forensic tool. And while I'm not opposed to using tariffs in that particular case, I think they should be very narrowly tailored to the scale of the distortion, and they should allow and create an incentive for the distorter to lower its distortion, and then when the distortion is lowered, the tariff goes away. So,
Yeah, in an ideal world, although, you know, that's hard to.
it's hard to do. It's very hard to do.
Hard to do,
But I think there's another reason why we do need to do something along these lines, because if you don't do it, and producers, let's say in the US, are going out of business because of that, then what happens? You know, you have no good argument when people say to you, which is what they did, you know, as China, you know, joined the WTO and as a lot of these practices affected, you know, the global economy. You have no argument when somebody says, my factory closed because of competition from China because of these distortions. Let's stipulate to that. That's the reason. And I've lost my job. And I'm 50 years old, 55 years old, and there's nothing I can do now. You have no argument against that in that case. And the person will therefore say, as they have done in the US and all over, you know, Latin America and other places, the problem is not that they won't say, you didn't deal with anti-competitive market distortions, you didn't deal with regulatory barriers. They'll say, liberalization is bad, globalization is bad. All of this new world is all bad, and I want protection. And then you'll get real, you know, heavyweight protection.
Yeah, then you're even in a worse.
And then you're in a much worse situation. And then your medicine is far worse than the disease you're trying to heal. And you will have created, because you will have people who come in who are, you know, think in mercantilist zero-sum terms, you will have a whole slew of policies that destroy wealth domestically as well as internationally. So I think, if you look at Chavez in Venezuela, for example, is a symptom of that, and I think you see that now in lots of countries. And so, for many reasons, we need to actually have a solution, and the sort of pure free trade sort of argument that this is okay because it's just lower prices, I don't think holds water in this particular case. And I would have no problem with using fairness to deal with that, that set of issues. But you've got to be very careful how you use it, and you can't use it, I think, for other things that relate to a country's actual comparative advantage. We generally have outcome-based approaches to these things. We don't say to a country, I don't like the way you produce your product, and therefore I'm going to discipline you. So I think you need to be very careful when you do that, if it's about the labour rules, the environmental rules, etc. Not to say that it's not important to have good labour rules and environmental rules, but you can deal with that in a fairness kind of context as well. I mean, you can say, in the case of labour, in the case of environment, countries have agreed internationally through international agreements particular things in the environment, in labour, and if a country is actually diverging from what it's already agreed, again for trade advantage, I've said that I'm not going to use a WTO agreement. I'm not going to use prison labour to sell products cheaply. We've all agreed this, and then country X decides that they can undercut the opposition by using prison labour. Clearly, that's a distortion, and clearly we need to do something about that. Now, the WTO has rules on prison labour, but it doesn't have rules on some of these other agreements that have been agreed between countries.
Yeah. So these anti-competitive market distortions, these ACMDs, very bad things, right? And it makes me wonder, we're having a lot of discussions about what's fair and what's equal and what's not fair and what's not equal. Where should fairness and equality, where does that come in? I mean, does it come in the beginning in terms of here are the rules of the game. These rules are fair to everybody, and now go for it? Or does it come in at the end, where if somebody ends up with a bigger slice of pie than another person, then that's not fair, and we need to figure it out.
And that is the prevailing sort of wisdom now, that we want, the fairness of a society is judged pretty much solely by the equality of that society in terms of outcome. Whereas, I agree with you, equality of opportunity is what we want to strive for. But when it comes to things like fairness and equality, one of the problems that we have, again, it comes back to this non-zero sum approach to economics. That when you have buyers and sellers coming together in voluntary exchange, that creates wealth. You create something out of nothing. And it's very counterintuitive to think of things in these terms, and that's one of the reasons it's difficult for people to get their heads around this. But you are actually creating something out of nothing, and you are creating wealth. Now, as I said earlier on, wealth is really easy to destroy. It's very hard to create. So we know that there are societies that have done you can make everybody equal. But the only way to make everybody equal is to make everyone equally poor. It is much more difficult, if not impossible, to make everyone sort of equally rich at the high end. Because if you allow equality of opportunity, then the whole structure, you get GDP per capita growth, which means the whole structure lifts people out of poverty. Everyone is lifted up. But because people are different, human beings are wonderfully different. They have different abilities. They have different desires to work for longer periods of time, different application and so forth. So if you create that kind of world, you will lift everyone out of poverty, and you will lift the whole structure up. But you will certainly get people who do much better than other people, because that's the nature of the human condition. We're not all the same.
And then people often say, well, that's not fair. I mean, it's not fair that, these other people are doing so much better than me.
And the problem is that when you try all the policies that you would adopt to try to stop or suppress the top layer of people, or the people, the individuals who are achieving, the people we talk about today, the billionaires, the Elon Musks, etc. of the world. Every time you try to damage them, in other words, take them down, and let's be clear, it's damaging them. You're trying to damage them. This does not bring the bottom layer up. All it does is it pushes everyone down. The structure goes down. Ultimately, in an extreme case of a communist country or whatever, you push the whole thing down so that everyone is equally poor. And you can do that. That's easy to do. It's easy to make everyone equally poor. Probably the best answer to the question I ever heard on this was actually given to me by my son when he was 14 years old, or it might have even been younger than that. And I asked him, I said the same question you asked me. I said, everyone's talking about fairness and equality. Is inequality a real problem in the world? Expecting an answer that, yeah, of course it's really bad and we must strive to be equal. And he didn't say that. He said, not if the poor are getting richer. And that encapsulated in one phrase exactly how this system works. Because in order to let the poor get richer, in order to bring them up out of poverty, there is only one way to do that, and that is through allowing the forces of competition to operate in the way that we've described, that creates wealth and efficiency and all these things, and that inevitably causes certain people to do really well. And it is, and you cannot change that. You cannot break them down. You cannot, cut the tall poppies, as it were, because when you do that, you sink the whole ship into the sea of poverty. And what tends to happen with policies that are fair or aimed at equality is people say, well, we don't need to grow so quickly. Why don't we trade a little bit of growth for equality? And the problem with that is that when you suppress growth, when you don't allow competition to unleash all these, positive results that lift people out of poverty, who is really harmed by that? It's the people at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder who are harmed. The rich can afford distortions and anti-competitive practices. The rich can afford for the system not to work very well for a time. I mean, eventually, even they can't afford it either. It's a bit like a ship that's sinking. The people in the bottom decks are the ones that drown first. Eventually, everyone's going to drown, but the people at the top, it'll take a while before they also drown, and it is possible for them to think that they are okay with this sort of lesser growth. And it also assumes that we're kind of at the end of the story. It assumes that we've seen all the growth that we can actually have. We've seen all the innovation we can actually have. Population is not going to grow anymore. And actually, there were people, we had this conversation before, where there were people in the 1930s who were writing that, there'll be no more population growth, there'll be no more innovation. So throughout history, people have said this. I think we are a long way away from seeing the end of innovation and the sum total of all of that, which means that there's a very big gap between where we are and where we could be.
Well, thank you, Shanker. That was a really new perspective on competition and fairness. Some thorny issues there, but I really appreciate you taking the time.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Christine, for having me.
Thank you.